I still remember the exact moment I found out I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving this year. My phone buzzed with a message from my mom. "We've decided it's best if you don't come to dinner. You embarrassed your sister last month, and this can't happen again." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening as a mix of disbelief and shame washed over me. Embarrassed my sister? I replayed every interaction in my mind, searching for what I could have possibly done to warrant this. I couldn't find a single moment that justified being punished like a child. My heart pounded, and I felt a hollow ache as reality sank in. My family, the people who were supposed to care, were turning against me. I tried calling my mom, leaving messages, begging for a conversation, but she ignored every attempt. The sting of favoritism cut deeper than I expected. My sister, oblivious to the turmoil she had caused, would be smiling, hosting, and receiving the praise that should have felt like shared family warmth. Meanwhile, I was left out, cast aside for a perceived slight that felt fabricated. I thought of the countless holidays before when I had quietly sacrificed, making sure my sister shone, staying behind the scenes to support her achievements. And yet, that was apparently my crime. I sat on my couch, phone clutched in my trembling hands, trying to make sense of the injustice. The words "you embarrassed your sister" replayed in my mind like a cruel mantra, twisting every memory I had into a distorted version where I was the villain. Confusion and disbelief turned into anger, simmering just beneath the surface. How could a family that had taught me love and loyalty suddenly treat me like a stranger, like someone unworthy of sitting at the same table? The very people who were supposed to defend me had chosen to believe the narrative spun by someone who had always thrived on attention. Every instinct in me screamed that this wasn't fair. I thought of the laughter, the warmth, the shared meals, and the inside jokes that used to make our family gatherings feel safe. Now, those memories were poisoned with the bitter taste of exclusion. I could practically feel the empty chair at the head of the table, the one that would have been mine, mocking me. The shame of being rejected stung more than any argument or criticism could have. I was being punished not for what I did, but for what someone else wanted everyone to believe I did. As I sank further into the emotional whirlpool, my mind began to race. If this was how easily they could discard me over a misunderstanding or maybe even a lie, what did that say about the rest of our relationships? Were all the sacrifices, the late night support, the quiet encouragements, just invisible to them? A knot formed in my stomach, blending hurt and a strange, creeping determination. I realized that this wasn't just about missing a meal. It was about being seen, being recognized, and reclaiming the dignity that had been so carelessly stripped away. Even through the shame, a flicker of resolve began to grow. I wouldn't stay silent forever. I wouldn't let this become the story my family told about me. The one where I was the disgraceful sibling, the one who ruined everything. I felt the first seeds of planning, of imagining a way to balance the scales, to ensure that the truth and my worth would be undeniable. The rejection cut deep, but in its pain, I sensed the spark of something powerful, a determination to rise, to confront the favoritism and the injustice, and to emerge unbroken. I looked around my apartment, empty and quiet, and for the first time, I let myself acknowledge the full weight of what had just happened. Thanksgiving would go on without me, my absence unnoticed by some, glaringly obvious to others. But I wouldn't fade into the background, I told myself. This exclusion was just the beginning, and as I sat there, hurt and humiliated, I realized something that both frightened and exhilarated me. They had no idea who they were really messing with. As the initial shock of being uninvited faded, I sank deeper into my thoughts, replaying years of subtle betrayals and favoritism that had quietly shaped my life. My parents had never said it outright, but it was always clear who they preferred, who deserved the praise, and who would be overlooked. I remembered countless achievements that went unnoticed, promotions they barely acknowledged, or the late nights I spent helping my sister with school projects, dinner, or emotional crises, only to have my efforts dismissed as what you should do anyway. Each memory carried a sting, a quiet weight I'd carried alone, believing love would balance the scales eventually. I thought about holidays past, when I'd quietly cleaned the kitchen, decorated the house, or stayed late to help set up parties, only to watch my sister step into the spotlight, receiving congratulations I'd silently earned alongside her. I had learned to smile, to nod, to celebrate her victories, even when my own accomplishments were ignored or belittled. It wasn't jealousy that ate at me, it was the unfairness, the invisible hierarchy my family had created, where love and recognition were distributed like favors, leaving me perpetually second best. Even small moments of neglect surfaced painfully in my mind. Birthday parties where my achievements were glossed over, family dinners where my suggestions were ignored, and casual comments that compared me unfavorably to my sister, all of them accumulated into a pattern that had gone unchallenged for too long. I had internalized the idea that my worth was tied to someone else's success, that my role was to support and disappear into the background. And yet, despite this conditioning, being explicitly excluded now felt like a cruel confirmation of everything I had feared, that I was permanently undervalued, replaceable, even disposable. The frustration bubbled inside me, not just at the unfair treatment, but at the helplessness I'd felt all these years. I had tried to prove myself in subtle ways, quietly striving for validation, hoping my parents would notice my sacrifices, my loyalty, my care. But they didn't. The acknowledgement I craved never came. Instead, the spotlight always fell on my sister, and the narrative framed me as the troublemaker, the one who caused problems, even when I was simply being myself. It was a pattern that had finally, brutally, culminated in this banishment, and yet, beneath the pain, I began to see clarity. Years of unnoticed efforts and quiet endurance had given me a perspective they could never understand. I had lived in the shadows, learned to navigate the family's twisted hierarchy, and developed a sense of self that was separate from their approval. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the quiet power in that realization. I didn't have to accept their story of me. I didn't have to be relegated to the margins any longer. As I sat there, reflecting on the countless moments of neglect, my anger began to fuse with determination. I realized that all those years of subtle betrayals had inadvertently prepared me for this moment. If they thought excluding me would make me disappear, they were gravely mistaken. I would find a way to reclaim my voice, my dignity, and perhaps even teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget. The pain was real, but so was the spark of resolve growing inside me, ready to turn years of invisibility into a story where I would finally be seen. On my own terms, I couldn't stop the memories from flooding back, each one a sharp reminder of how my sister had always been the center of attention. In school, she was the star student, the one whose projects were displayed in the hallways, who won every award, and whose teachers raved about her potential. Meanwhile, my achievements, though meaningful, were quietly acknowledged or overlooked entirely. I remembered the science fair where I spent weeks designing a model I was proud of, only for my sister's project to steal the spotlight. Her name splashed in the newsletter while mine barely got a mention. I had clapped for her, forced a smile, and congratulated her. But inside, I felt the sting of invisibility. Socially, it was the same. Birthday parties, family gatherings, and community events seemed to orbit her, with people laughing at her jokes, praising her outfits, and hanging on every word she said. I was the one standing to the side, listening, absorbing, trying not to be noticed. My presence almost optional. The contrast was brutal. She was admired, radiant, and touchable. I was cautious, careful, always calculating how to navigate around the glare of her perfection. Every compliment she received felt like a reminder of my place in the hierarchy, the invisible line that separated me from being truly celebrated. Even at home, the favoritism was subtle but constant. My parents' eyes lit up when she entered a room, their voices warm and proud when they spoke of her accomplishments. My own successes were met with polite nods, perfunctory praise, or comparisons to her achievements. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" was a phrase that haunted me from childhood into adulthood. A reminder that no matter what I did, it was never quite enough. The rejection, though often wrapped in love, left me feeling perpetually inadequate, yearning for recognition I rarely received. I remembered evenings when I would study alone, preparing for exams or working on personal projects. While my sister's brilliance drew all the attention and support, she would leave the room laughing, confident, adored, while I remained in quiet shadows, feeling the weight of being unseen. Every family dinner, every casual comment reinforced the stark contrast: admired versus overlooked, powerful versus invisible. It was a pattern that had been ingrained over years, a subtle but relentless shaping of my sense of self in relation to her. And yet, amid the hurt, I also recognized how those years of being in her shadow had forced me to observe, to strategize, and to understand dynamics I might otherwise have ignored. I had learned patience, subtlety, and the power of internal strength. The contrast between her public brilliance and my quiet resilience was more than just a painful imbalance. It had become a foundation I could draw from, a secret well of determination that no one had noticed or appreciated. The seeds of resolve were planted in those early years, even as I watched her shine. And now, finally, I was beginning to see a path where the scales could tilt in my favor. Thanksgiving came and went, and I experienced it entirely through filter updates and secondhand messages. Photos of my family laughing round the dining table appeared on social media, each one a sharp reminder of my absence. My sister, radiant in a designer dress, smiled as everyone complimented her cooking and toasted to her hard work, while I sat alone, scrolling through images that felt like daggers. The table sparkled with expensive china and decorations my parents had bragged about, every detail a subtle reminder of the world I was excluded from. I wasn't just missing a meal, I was witnessing the hierarchy of my family play out without me, a silent spectator to their adoration of her. I could almost hear their laughter in my head, the inside jokes that had once included me now exchanged without a single thought of my existence. Cousins I had grown up with seemed to gather around her, attentive and deferential, while my absence went unremarked in person, though social media made it painfully visible. The subtle power dynamics were clear. She was the favored child, admired and celebrated, and I was the outsider, the one who had caused problems and therefore didn't belong. Every shared smile, every toast in her honor, underscored my exclusion, and the humiliation of being cast aside stung worse than any direct insult could have. I remembered previous holidays where I had worked behind the scenes, preparing dishes, cleaning up, ensuring the gatherings went smoothly, all while my sister basked in the attention. Now, the tables had turned, or so it seemed, but not in my favor. Her elevated status at the table, the admiration she effortlessly commanded, felt like a public announcement of my inferior position. Even though I had spent years contributing quietly, my role had been erased entirely. It wasn't just that I wasn't there, it was that everyone knew I wasn't there for a reason they deemed justified. Scrolling through the captions and comments on family posts, I noticed the casual remarks. "She's really outdone herself this year. The dinner looked perfect, wish you were here." But I understand. The thinly veiled acknowledgement of my absence cut deeper than any confrontation ever could. It was as if my family had rehearsed this exclusion, each word designed to confirm my secondary status while celebrating my sister. I felt the familiar mix of anger and shame, but beneath it, a spark of clarity began to form. They thought they had diminished me, silenced me, and humiliated me. But in reality, they had only set the stage for what was coming next. As I sat alone, nursing my coffee and scrolling through the images of laughter, food, and family cheer, I realized how sharp the contrast had become. Their joy, her glory, and my exclusion all existed in the same frame, a cruel visual of favoritism and social hierarchy. Yet beneath the humiliation, a quiet, simmering resolve began to take shape. I might have been absent from their dinner, but I was not powerless, and I would find a way to turn this moment of public rejection into the catalyst for my own vindication. I wasn't expecting him to reach out, Not in a million years. Her boyfriend, someone I'd barely spoken to beyond polite greetings, sent a message asking to meet me privately. My heart raced with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. When we met, he didn't waste words. "You need to know the truth about her," he said, eyes flicking nervously around as if the walls themselves were listening. My pulse quickened. What could he possibly mean? I braced myself for rumors, exaggerations, maybe even more ways to humiliate me. But what he revealed stunned me to my core. He started slowly, recounting incidents I had never known. How my sister had manipulated friends to isolate me socially. How she had exaggerated stories to paint me as reckless or irresponsible. And even how she had twisted small family misunderstandings into narratives where I was always at fault. Each revelation was a punch to my chest, but also a strange liberation finally. Someone outside the family acknowledged what I had long suspected. The injustices weren't imagined. They were real, deliberate, and meticulously orchestrated by the person I had trusted most as a sibling. As he spoke, I felt a swirl of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and an odd flicker of empowerment. For years, I had believed I was simply unlucky or inadequate, but the truth painted a very different picture. She had been playing a game I hadn't even realized I was part of. And now, for the first time, I had the insight to play my own game, one where the stakes were justice, dignity, and the reversal of the rules we had been assigned for so long. The tension in the air was electric, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall could be either devastating or liberating. He paused and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You've been underestimated your whole life. They think they know who you are, but they don't. You have the power to change the story if you're ready." My mind raced. I thought of every slight, every invisible sacrifice, every moment I had been dismissed. And now, I realized that those years of being underestimated weren't weaknesses, they were preparation. If I played this carefully, I could turn the narrative around in a way that would leave them reeling. As I walked away from that conversation, a plan began to form in my mind. I wasn't impulsive, but I could feel the first stirrings of strategy and determination. The unfairness I had endured suddenly felt like fuel. Each secret he had revealed was a piece of a puzzle, a map to reclaiming power in a family that had long ignored me. The sense of being powerless was slipping away, replaced by the thrilling knowledge that I now held information they could never anticipate. For the first time since receiving that exclusion message, I felt a flicker of hope and danger. I realized that this wasn't just about being uninvited from Thanksgiving anymore. It was about correcting a lifetime of imbalance, about reclaiming respect and recognition on my own terms. And as I left that meeting, my heart pounding, I knew the next steps had to be deliberate, precise, and undeniable. The revenge arc wasn't just possible, it was already beginning. Quietly, but irresistibly, and they had no idea it was coming. I spent the next few days in quiet reflection, letting the weight of what I'd learned settle in. The initial shock and anger had faded, replaced by a focused clarity. I realized that if I reacted impulsively, it would play into the narrative my family already believed, that I was reckless, immature, and easily humiliated. No, this had to be strategic. Every move needed to be deliberate, measured, and impossible to dismiss. I began mapping out the ways I could reclaim my dignity while subtly exposing the injustices I'd endured for years. I reminded myself of the power I'd built quietly over time, my accomplishments, my independence, my network of friends and colleagues who respected me. These were the tools I had ignored for too long, thinking they weren't enough to counter the family's favoritism. But now, I saw them in a new light: leverage. I didn't need loud confrontations or dramatic outbursts. I needed precision, timing, and an understanding of human behavior. I knew how my sister operated, how she relied on appearances, how she expected compliance, and I intended to use that knowledge against her. The plan formed slowly in my mind, like a chess game unfolding move by move. First, I would create subtle opportunities for her manipulation and dishonesty to be revealed, letting her unravel on her own, without my direct interference. Next, I would cultivate visibility for my own achievements, showing not telling that I was not the failure they had painted me to be. Every action would be calculated to build tension, to let the contrast between her perceived perfection and my quiet competence emerge naturally. I wanted the payoff to feel inevitable, a moral truth that could not be denied. I also spent time reflecting on my own emotions, ensuring that anger or resentment didn't cloud my judgment. Emotional intelligence would be my greatest weapon. I had learned to navigate family dynamics, to anticipate reactions, and to exploit blind spots, all without appearing vengeful. The subtlety of my plan would make it all the more effective. When the truth came to light, it would be undeniable, and the embarrassment would be undeniable as well. I would turn the tables without stooping to the petty or cruel tactics my sister might expect. Even as I plotted, I allowed myself moments of internal validation, reminding myself that I was worthy of recognition and respect. Years of feeling invisible had only sharpened my focus and resilience. I could feel a simmering confidence growing, a sense that the next moves I made would be decisive. The injustice I had endured was not a weakness. It was preparation, and as I pieced together the first steps of my strategy, a quiet thrill ran through me. I wasn't just surviving the favoritism and betrayal anymore. I was positioning myself to emerge not only vindicated, but undeniably respected. I began quietly planting the seeds of my resurgence, choosing small but visible acts that no one could ignore. It started with a project at work I had poured endless hours into, the kind of achievement that demanded recognition. When the announcement came that I had been promoted ahead of schedule, my parents' casual social media comments betrayed a flicker of surprise. My sister, who usually thrived on attention, barely knew how to respond, caught off guard by the subtle shift in status. It wasn't loud or confrontational, but it was enough to make them notice that I wasn't invisible anymore. Next, I leveraged my social connections, attending events and gatherings that subtly highlighted my accomplishments and independence. I shared stories of new ventures, volunteer projects, and personal achievements in casual conversations, carefully framing them to be noticed without seeming boastful. The reaction was telling glances that lingered too long, compliments that felt hesitant, and a subtle tension in the room as my family adjusted to the reality that I had quietly amassed respect and influence outside their carefully controlled narrative. Even small gestures amplified the effect. I attended a mutual friends gathering and casually mentioned a speaking engagement I had been invited to, noting in passing that I had been asked because of my expertise. The sister, present in the room, shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between me and our parents. Their faces betrayed a mixture of disbelief and begrudging acknowledgement. I smiled inwardly, savoring the tiny cracks forming in the facade that had always elevated her above me. These were subtle victories, but in a family built on appearances and favoritism, even whispers of my competence were powerful. I made sure that every act was deliberate, timed to maximize impact. Invitations I had once been overlooked for now arrived with enthusiasm. Comments that had previously gone unnoticed now included recognition of my contributions, and acquaintances who had only known me as my sister's sibling began engaging with me directly. The discomfort in my family's demeanor was unmistakable. They were witnessing, slowly, the emergence of a version of me that they had never anticipated, a confident, capable, and independent presence that could no longer be dismissed at. As these small public wins accumulated, I felt my own confidence growing, each subtle acknowledgement reinforcing the narrative I had longed to tell, that I was not the weak, invisible sibling they had framed me to be. And as I observed the flickers of unease in their expressions, I knew the stage was being set for larger, undeniable revelations. The subtle power shift had begun, and with patience and precision, the eventual reckoning would be impossible to ignore. As my small victories began to ripple through the family, I realized that the path forward wasn't as simple as I had imagined. Each step I took carried the weight of potential exposure, the risk that my intentions might be misunderstood or twisted. I wrestled with the moral dilemma of how far to go. How much could I reveal without becoming the villain in the story my family loved to tell about me? Every calculated move required patience and emotional intelligence, balancing the desire for justice with the need to maintain my own integrity. The line between clever strategy and cruelty felt thinner than I expected. I could sense its subtle shifts in their behavior, glances exchanged at family gatherings, hushed whispers when I entered the room. My sister, usually so confident and untouchable, seemed slightly on edge, a flicker of uncertainty in her posture and tone. My parents, too, were reacting to the changes I had orchestrated, though they refused to acknowledge it outright. It was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. My family's narrative of control was starting to unravel, and I was the unseen hand guiding it. Each interaction became a high-stakes game. Invitations, casual compliments, and small acknowledgments were no longer neutral. They were indicators, subtle confirmations that my plan was making an impact. And yet, with every tiny victory, I questioned myself. Was I being fair? Was it revenge? Or was it simply self-preservation? The tension of balancing justice with morality gnawed at me. But I reminded myself that years of neglect and favoritism had forced me into this position. I had endured their judgments silently for too long, and now I had the opportunity to assert my worth without crossing into cruelty. The suspense built with each passing day. Every family dinner, social gathering, or shared event became a test of patience and strategy. I watched closely, reading expressions, noting reactions, and adjusting my approach accordingly. My sister's overconfidence, once so natural, now made her vulnerable, and I felt the rush of knowing I could tip the scales subtly, invisibly, without appearing vindictive. The balance of power was shifting, and I was careful to let it happen in slow, undeniable increments, ensuring the moment of reckoning would be all the more devastating when it arrived. By the end of these tense days, the unease was palpable. My sister had begun to sense that the world was no longer operating entirely in her favor, and my parents, though unwilling to admit it, were noticing the changes too. I had successfully introduced doubt and uncertainty into the perfect image they had carefully curated for years, and the suspense hung in the air like electricity. Every decision I made now mattered more than ever, and I understood that patience, strategy, and moral clarity would determine whether the eventual reversal of power would be satisfying or squandered. The night of the family gathering arrived, and I could feel the tension in the air long before I walked through the door. Everything was meticulously planned, my demeanor calm, my words measured, my timing precise. I had rehearsed the conversation in my head countless times, anticipating every possible reaction. The room was filled with chatter and laughter, the usual clinking of glasses and casual banter that had once made me feel invisible. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different, charged, as if the air itself knew something monumental was about to happen. I waited patiently, letting my sister bask in the attention she so often commanded, smiling and deflecting compliments as though nothing could touch her. Then, at the precise moment when all eyes were on her, I casually interjected with a story from the past, an incident she had twisted to make me look reckless, dishonest, or incompetent. I spoke slowly, deliberately, recounting the facts as I knew them, adding the details that proved she had manipulated friends, colleagues, and family members for her own gain. The room grew silent. I could see her smile falter, a flicker of panic crossing her face as people began to grasp the contrast between the polished version of events she had promoted and the truth I was revealing. I didn't shout or accuse. I simply let the facts speak for themselves. I referenced moments everyone had witnessed, but interpreted differently, clarifying the actions and intentions that had been distorted over time. My parents' expressions shifted from polite amusement to confusion, and then to dawning realization. Cousins, aunts, and uncles who had been silent spectators started whispering among themselves, the pieces falling into place. My sister's attempts to interject were clumsy, defensive, and increasingly desperate, each denial only highlighting her earlier manipulations. As the tension escalated, I introduced the final twist: evidence she could not deny. Emails, messages, and corroborating accounts from friends revealed the depth of her deception. The room collectively held its breath as her carefully constructed image crumbled in real time. I watched the power shift before my eyes, the social dynamics that had once excluded me now bending in my favor. Her discomfort was palpable, her usual confidence replaced by vulnerability. People who had previously ignored me or assumed I was secondary now saw me as competent, composed, and undeniably justified in speaking out. The emotional payoff was immediate. Relief, validation, and vindication surged through me as I witnessed the consequences of her actions unfold publicly. The room's energy shifted from tension to awe, then to murmurs of agreement and moral alignment. My sister, trapped by her own behavior, had no way to redirect the narrative. The truth was undeniable, and her social standing wavered in front of everyone who mattered. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from cruelty, but from finally being seen and acknowledged for the injustices I had endured for so long. By the end of the evening, the gathering had transformed. What began as another routine family event had become a stage for justice, powered by patience, observation, and strategic execution. The reversal of power was complete. I was no longer the overlooked sibling, and my sister's manipulations had been exposed for all to see. In that charged moment, I realized that the story was no longer hers to control. I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and my rightful place not through anger, but through precision, courage, and the undeniable weight of truth. The aftermath of the reveal was immediate and undeniable. My sister, usually the center of attention, now sat awkwardly, her confident smile replaced with a nervous, tight-lipped expression. Conversations that had previously revolved around her accomplishments shifted subtly toward me, acknowledging my calm composure and the evidence I had presented. People who once assumed I was secondary now treated me differently, listening attentively, nodding in agreement, and offering congratulations. The contrast was staggering. Her usual power and charm, once untouchable, had been replaced by a fragile uncertainty, while I, long relegated to the shadows, stood clearly recognized and respected. The moral fallout hit her harder than I could have imagined. Family members who had once turned a blind eye now questioned her actions, her manipulations, and the fairness of the dynamics she had maintained for years. Even casual acquaintances who had been complicit in small ways began to distance themselves, sensing the shift in perception. The social leverage she had relied on evaporated, leaving her isolated in ways I had only imagined during my darkest moments of exclusion. Every subtle glance, hesitant comment, and awkward pause confirmed that the power balance had shifted irreversibly. I felt a surge of vindication as I witnessed her embarrassment unfold naturally, without exaggeration or theatrics. I hadn't orchestrated humiliation for its own sake. I had exposed truth and allowed reality to speak, and in doing so, I achieved something I had longed for: recognition. People began to see me not as the sibling who caused trouble or was in the wrong, but as someone composed, intelligent, and undeniably justified. The contrast between my previous invisibility and this newfound acknowledgement was profound. Rejected and overlooked for years, I was now empowered, commanding attention not through spectacle, but through undeniable evidence and moral clarity. Even my parents, who had once minimized my presence, began to treat me with a careful respect. There was no overcompensation, no forced praise, just the quiet acknowledgement that their assumptions had been wrong. The rejection I had endured for so long now appeared glaringly unfair, a sharp counterpoint to the recognition I had finally earned. I could see the lesson settling in, subtly but clearly, as they recalibrated their view of both me and my sister. As the evening wore on, the social dynamics continued to reinforce the shift. People sought my input on decisions, asked my opinions, and included me in conversations that had previously passed me by. The empowerment I felt was intoxicating, but tempered with reflection. This wasn't about winning a petty battle. It was about reclaiming agency, dignity, and the social standing that had been denied to me for so long. And as I observed the lingering discomfort in my sister's posture, I understood that justice had await all its own, a balance restored not through anger, but through patience, strategy, and unwavering truth. By the end of the night, the transformation was complete. I had moved from powerless observer to recognized participant, from rejected outsider to respected insider. The contrast framing was undeniable. The sister who had thrived on manipulation and favoritism now faced the consequences of her actions, while I emerged not only vindicated, but stronger, confident, and fully seen. For the first time in years, I felt the clarity of triumph tempered with dignity, the satisfaction of a long overdue reckoning that was as moral was social. After the chaos of the gathering settled, I found a quiet moment alone, letting the weight of the evening wash over me. Relief came first, a deep exhale that released years of tension, shame, and anxiety. I had finally spoken my truth, and it had been acknowledged, understood, and respected. The vindication felt real, not fleeting, an affirmation that my patience, strategy, and restraint had all been worth it. For the first time in years, I felt fully seen, fully heard, and fully validated. Pride followed, a quiet but powerful sensation. I wasn't just proud of exposing the truth. I was proud of how I had done it with composure, intelligence, and emotional control. I hadn't stooped to manipulation or cruelty. I had allowed the facts to speak for themselves. The empowerment was more than social, it was internal. I recognized my own worth independent of my sister's shadow, independent of my parents' favoritism. That realization, hard-earned and deeply personal, brought a sense of liberation that I hadn't anticipated. But amid the relief and pride lingered a subtle sadness. I mourned the years spent feeling invisible, the opportunities I had lost while my sister thrived, and the quiet suffering I had endured to maintain family harmony. Those memories were part of me, and even as justice had been restored, they could not be erased. I acknowledged them, allowing myself to grieve for the versions of myself that had been overlooked, dismissed, or undervalued. In that grief, however, I found resilience, the knowledge that enduring those years had shaped the person I had become. I reflected on my transformation, understanding how much I had grown through the process. I had learned patience, strategy, and emotional intelligence, developing a strength that was both internal and visible. The humiliation that once defined me had become a catalyst for growth. The favoritism that once constrained me had revealed the areas where I could assert agency. I saw clearly how the emotional journey from rejection to vindication had fundamentally reshaped my self-perception and my approach to relationships, both within and outside the family. By the time the night ended, I felt a deep sense of closure. The social hierarchy had shifted, the injustices addressed, and my personal dignity restored. Yet I also recognized that true catharsis wasn't just in public recognition, it was in the internal understanding that I had navigated the ordeal with integrity, emotional intelligence, and moral clarity. Sitting quietly, I allowed myself to savor the relief, pride, and even the lingering sadness, knowing that each emotion was part of the journey that had led me from powerless exclusion to empowered acknowledgement. As the days passed, I found myself reflecting on the entire ordeal, seeing the patterns and lessons woven through years of family dynamics. I realized that favoritism, manipulation, and exclusion had been constant forces, shaping not only how I was treated, but how I viewed myself. Yet, those same challenges had also forced me to develop resilience, patience, and emotional intelligence. The very struggles that once made me feel powerless had equipped me with the tools to reclaim my voice and assert my worth with dignity. I thought about the importance of boundaries and self-respect, understanding that true empowerment comes from recognizing one's own value rather than relying on external validation. My journey had taught me that silence in the face of injustice was not weakness, but a choice, and that speaking out strategically, with clarity and composure, could transform not only perceptions, but relationships. I had learned to navigate complexity without losing my integrity, a skill that would serve me far beyond the confines of my family. The experience also left me with a nuanced perspective on empathy and forgiveness. While my sister had caused pain and manipulated others, I understood that people often act out of insecurity, envy, or fear. That insight didn't excuse her actions, but it allowed me to approach the aftermath without malice, maintaining my own moral clarity while letting consequences unfold naturally. I felt lighter for having processed the emotions fully, for having turned humiliation into insight, and for having reclaimed agency in a world that had long overlooked me. Most importantly, I recognized the power of self-advocacy. By asserting myself thoughtfully and strategically, I had shifted not only my family's perception, but also my own sense of identity. I was no longer the overlooked sibling, the one cast aside for perceived flaws. I had become someone who could navigate challenges with intelligence, patience, and grace, someone whose worth was undeniable. The subtle moral takeaway lingered. Life may hand you injustice, favoritism, or exclusion, but how you respond with composure, courage, and strategy determines the ultimate outcome. As I reflected, a calm satisfaction settled over me. I had reclaimed dignity, exposed truth, and grown in ways I hadn't anticipated. My family dynamics, though complicated, had taught me lessons that extended far beyond the holiday table. And as I looked forward, I carried with me not only vindication, but a sense of empowerment that no one could take away, a quiet, enduring triumph that felt as rewarding as any public acknowledgement. In the weeks following the gathering, I found myself navigating family interactions with a new perspective. The tension had eased slightly, but the dynamics remained complex. I realized that empowerment didn't require severing all ties or fostering bitterness. It meant choosing how, when, and with whom to engage. I was no longer trapped in the reactive patterns of the past. I could interact with my family on my own terms, maintaining boundaries that protected my dignity while leaving room for dialogue and potential reconciliation. I approached conversations with calm confidence, letting my actions speak louder than words. My sister, still adjusting to the shift in perception, began to show glimpses of humility, though whether it was genuine or tactical, I couldn't yet tell. I chose to observe rather than judge, recognizing that her journey and mine were separate yet intertwined. This awareness allowed me to feel a sense of control, understanding that empowerment came from clarity, not retaliation. I no longer needed to compete for attention or validation. I simply held my space and let the truth of my worth shine quietly, but unmistakably. In this period of reflection, I also considered what it meant to forgive or at least release resentment without forgetting the lessons learned. My family had shaped me in ways I couldn't erase, but I had transformed pain into strength. I had cultivated patience, strategy, and emotional intelligence, and those tools were now mine to carry into future relationships. The boundaries I set weren't walls to isolate myself, but shields to protect my growth, allowing me to engage with authenticity rather than fear or insecurity. There was a quiet intrigue in the new balance we had reached. Relationships might shift, apologies might come, or perhaps they wouldn't, but the uncertainty no longer frightened me. I had learned that empowerment didn't require certainty from others. It came from owning my story, asserting my voice, and honoring my own values. And as I moved forward, I carried a settled sense of triumph. I had reclaimed agency, dignity, and self-respect in a world that had long underestimated me, leaving open the possibility that the family I once felt excluded from could witness, and perhaps even appreciate, the person I had become.